It's Thursday, February 22nd. I'm Adam Walsh. This is The Signal. Today on the show, the politics of climate change in this province. We will talk about the future of oil and gas, the green transition, protecting communities from extreme weather, and more. So don't go anywhere. Welcome everyone. This is one of those days, if you're listening and thinking, I'd really love to watch the radio, you're in luck. We are live streaming today's show, so go to cbc.ca/NL or the CBC NL YouTube page and enjoy. We are living through this crucial point when it comes to climate change, right? The Paris Climate Agreement set a goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally not more than 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial temps. That lower target, it's looming, and extreme weather stories and their impacts are everywhere, including in this province. We're also approaching the next sitting of the province's House of Assembly, of the legislature. And with our elected members getting ready for the session, I wanted folks here in studio for a climate change policy discussion. Because policy matters, right? It's part of that roadmap of where we're heading. And there's lots to talk about when it comes to that map. So I would like to welcome three folks into studio here today. Bernard Davis, Minister of Environment and Climate Change and Liberal MHA for Virginia Waters Pleasantville.
Hello.
Welcome back. How you doing?
Excellent. How are you today?
Good. Lloyd Parrott, PC Energy Critic and MHA for Terra Nova. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
And Jim Dinn, Leader of the NDP and MHA for St. John's Centre. Hi.
Welcome. Thanks for having me.
All right. We're all here, sat down, ready to go for a chat. I got a clip to play, so pop on your headphones. We only have two for the whole show, but for this part, you got to have them on to listen. Here's a clip of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres at the start of the COP28 climate summit late last year in Dubai.
Just days ago, I was on the melting ice of Antarctica. Not long before, I was among the melting glaciers of Nepal. These two spots are far in distance, but united in crisis. Polar ice and glaciers are vanishing before our eyes, causing a shock the world over, from landslides and floods to rising seas. But this is just one symptom of the sickness bringing our climate to its knees. A sickness only you, global leaders, can cure. Record emissions, ferocious fires, deadly droughts, and the hottest year ever. We can guarantee it even we are still in November. We are miles from the goals of the Paris Agreement and minutes to midnight for the 1.5 degree limit. But it is not too late. We can, you can, prevent planetary crash and burn. We have the technologies to avoid the worst of climate chaos if we act now.
Antonio Guterres there. He's talking about global leaders. I'm talking to provincial ones. So let's kick this off with, are we doing enough in this province when it comes to policy and climate change? Go to the minister first.
It's a very good question, very powerful, thought-provoking clip for sure. And the simple answer is no. I mean, I'm not going to sit here or sat here, as you said, and say that we've accomplished any kind of goals that we've set that way. We've got a lot of work to do as a global community. And that's the same here in this province and this country. We need to do more and do it faster and be efficient as we can doing it. But it's going to take, as a regatta goer like I am, it's going to take everyone pulling on the oar together. And we've had some great successes, mind you, but we're nowhere near there yet, and there's a lot of work to be done. Mr.
Parrott, what do you think?
Well, I would say if we have a look at Muskrat Falls, Churchill Falls, Beta Spear, multiple green energy projects we have around. North Atlantic Oil Refinery started producing renewable diesel today. I believe that Newfoundland is a leader in the Canadian market, and I believe we will be going forward. But I would also say that climate change is certainly a real issue, and it affects Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. But there are multiple other things that affect Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, and our transition into a green economy and a green world has to keep the people that live here in mind.
Mr. Dinn?
No, I think I do believe that there's more that we can do. I look at. I think there's a recent announcement that Minister Abbott made about more or less climate resiliency, about 4 million. I think it was the amount, 4 point something million. Yet, if you look at Hurricane Fiona, I think the government paid out almost 42 million in repairs. It was probably one of the top 10 climate disasters that struck Newfoundland and Labrador. And if you look at the Insurance Bureau of Canada, the insurable cost $7 million. So I think even in our response to that, we haven't even. I don't know if we fully underappreciate how exposed Newfoundland is to this climate change in terms of our renewable resources, fisheries, and so on and so forth. Could we be doing more? Sure. We did put forward, at the NDP, a private member's resolution to look at a just transition legislation, which was voted down. But at the same time, there was a commitment from the minister, and the last time we met here, to bring in just transition legislation, I think, which would signal a clear indication on the part of this government to address these issues.
So where are we with that for our thinking? Because there's consultations going on for the next round of the planning and the approach for climate change, right? Those are ongoing now because the current strategy or plan, it's ending this year, and then you're pushing towards 2030. So where are things with that planning and for what Mr. Din said?
So that's a very good question. The new Climate Change Action Plan, we've just finished public consultation on our portal just over the last week or so. But we've separated the plan into two different areas, and Mr. Din highlighted a little bit of the reason why we're doing that. One is the reductions for greenhouse gas emissions and targets and making it more attainable, or not attainable, sorry, making it more measurable. So when we see what the recommendations are, then we'll have a way to check back to make sure we've achieved those. And then the other plan will be a mitigation plan for adaptation. So, that's a part of the problem that we're seeing in the province. And everyone that lives in Newfoundland loves Newfoundland because of the vistas and the shorelines. And a lot of people have moved on those vistas and shorelines over the last, 500 years. Yeah. And to try to change a mentality and ensuring that we do flood risk mapping and storm surge mapping, so that what happened in the southwest coast of the province, when we build back better. We make sure that the municipalities or LSDs or community organizations understand where the floods can happen and where we can see those impacts happen to them. So when they build infrastructure and houses, in this case in the Southwest Coast houses, that they won't be back in those floodplains anymore.
So with that, the breakwater in Trepassey finished in July. A chunk of it was just ruined, right? I think the federal, correct me if I'm wrong here, the federal government paid for it. A provincial engineer would have had to have signed off on it. But we're taking these things like a breakwater. It's like, oh, this needs to be fixed. We fix it. Wasn't built well enough for the new reality that we're in. Like, what are your comments or what are your thoughts around just looking at how government's functioning for our understanding of what we're dealing with, and then looking at a brand new breakwater and being like, a fifth of it or whatever it is it was collapsed?
That's not good enough, for sure. If things are built, we want to make sure they're built to the best ability they can be. I mean, anything can happen with respect to built infrastructure. I mean, but we got to make sure.
Oh, yeah, stuff happens.
Yeah, so we got to make sure that it's built as strong as we possibly can, and that those. It's not in my department per se, but it's an all of government approach. We've got to make sure that when we build infrastructure, it's the strongest and can sustain the climate change factor. And that's an important piece, that when we build an infrastructure, whether we put a culvert across the highway in Deer Lake, we want to make sure it's big enough that, when the water comes again, and it will, that it can sustain it without having a washout like it did for, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago.
Mr. Perrott, your thoughts just on voting down the 2022 bit that the NDP put forward for just transition and where your party is?
Yeah, so I would say, listen, if you want to lead or create good policy, you have to be able to listen. And the first thing I would go to is something that the minister just said with regards to consultations. If you want to go see coastal erosion or understand the inability to put a heat pump into a house in rural Newfoundland because of a 100-amp service or any of those types of things, you can't have your consultation done over the internet where these communities do not have internet access. So are they hearing the voices of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians? The answer is no. The next thing is we have a responsibility to people fiscally. You can go to somewhere like the District of Terra Nova, where there was just a new bridge put in going down to Bonavista Highway. Yep. From an environmental standpoint, there was a requirement to raise this bridge almost 3 meters. No bathymetric study done, no ice flow study, no ice flows out underneath that bridge. It's really a waste of taxpayers' money. It could have been done more feasibly and more responsibly. We need to listen to people, visit the areas, and understand exactly what they face. Climate change is real. We can't react based on the fact that something happened this year from a weather event. We talked all year about this being the worst forest fire index rating in recent history. So the last worst one was 1979. So what happened between 1979 and 2024? We need to ask those types of questions. We've had massive forest fires in Labrador and throughout the province in the past, and this year was terrible. We're lucky that people got out of the Bay d'Espoir area. The roads were closed, but maybe we need to look at things like points of egress and ingress so people have the ability to get around those types of things. When we talk about climate change and policy that's put in place right now, and we want to be real, we can't be putting thermal generation plants on the south coast of Labrador or the north coast of Labrador. Brand new plants going in. We just got a brand new ferry being delivered. There's no electrification. It's a diesel generation. So there's things we can do much better.
So I was curious, when you look at, I'll go to Trepassey again, right, that breakwater. If you have an instance like this, so you're trying to protect folks, right? You put a breakwater in place and it's not doing its job. There's also a conversation, and this is looking at Port aux Basques, anywhere coastally too. There's a conversation about managed retreat. And as politicians, are you ready to be talking to folks of like, hey, maybe parts of towns can't live in the parts of towns where they've been living for the last few hundred years anymore? And like there's listening, but there's also communicating the reality of the danger of where people are living. Like is your party ready to be doing that, and is there a plan for it?
Well, there needs to be a conversation, and we need to understand. And when we create infrastructure in this province, we create it based on estimates that are done by government engineers. Government engineers who necessarily haven't visited the site or understand what's going on. The breakwater in Trepassey has been an issue for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
It's not the first fix.
Nope.
We should have known. So from an engineering standpoint, if the previous spec was a 36-inch riprap, then we know that we may need to go to a 48 or a 56-inch riprap, heavier stone, different sedimentation. We build bund walls to keep the ocean out when we built the Hebron rig, and we can do the same in areas like Trepassey. But we need to do the proper engineering and understand what is required. And what happens is when a bid comes back in and it's over the budget, and the budgets have increased based on COVID and recent cost of fuel, cost of doing business. We need to understand that we need to engineer things, and then we need to worry about the cost.
Minister Davis, I want to go back to COP28 for a second. You were there.
Yep.
Why is it important for you to go to something like this? You're a provincial minister. You're not the federal one.
Absolutely, I think it's really important because if we want to grow Newfoundland and Labrador, we've got to take the approach that we've got to be where people are that want to invest in clean tech, clean energy, CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Those are the big key players, which is part of the reason why I went. I was on a panel similar to this with the Premier of Alberta and Saskatchewan that were talking about the CCUS in their communities and what can happen here for us. The opportunity that exists, that's going to be billions of dollars of new money coming into our province. If you want to sit at home and expect that the 530,000 plus souls are going to be able to, economically invest in the province and grow the province, well, then that's one approach. That's not an approach we believe in our party. We believe that it's really important to be out there making sure that we can bring investment in. You don't need to look any further than having the Chancellor of Germany come over here to talk about wind turbines and hydrogen opportunity that exists in our province. We all know how windy Newfoundland and Labrador is, and we all know the opportunity of a skilled labour force we have. And Jim talked about a just transition. I've met with the Canadian Labour Congress on that over at COP, talking about what we're doing. And I always think that the just transition term has been weaponized as anti-oil or anti-something else.
It can be a
way.
loaded term nowadays, but what you mean is just transitioning to what comes next
Correct.
in an economy where you're trying to move beyond carbonization.
So this is where I believe that creating opportunity, employment, skilled labor, that's why looking at the investments that are being made, not by the provincial government, by external countries and or industry, to things like hydrogen. That's where we need to be looking at, and oil and gas for that matter as well. I mean,
will we see in the next round of planning for climate policy for this province? So will we see language around a just transition then?
You'll see language about it creating employment, absolutely, and you'll see language around the when we talked about this last year about a just transition. Yep. We've been working very hard on creating opportunity for people to transition, whether that be operating training opportunities for them, investing in training for people to transition out of the oil and gas sector when that time comes. We're in a period of transition, as we keep talking about, and I hate to use that word all the time, but we're an oil-producing province in an oil-producing federation. And, we have to transition from that at some point. That
Yeah,
transition.
so are you recognizing, as they said at the UN at the end of COP, the UN saying it signals the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era? Is this something you're recognizing?
We've always recognized that fossil fuel is going to end at some point. And, there's a need out there now for it. And my thought and our party's thought and our government's focus has always been to invest in that, making sure the people that are in the oil and gas sector have the opportunity to transition when time comes for that to happen. There's a product that we have in off our shores that is required around the world. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing that as the most efficient way possible.
Mr. Din, your thoughts on either COP or just what the minister's saying?
When we brought in with the Just Transition legislation, it wasn't about weaponizing. It was about two things: recognizing the fact that the world is already transitioning away from that resource. You look at the European Union; they're looking at going to renewables. It's a recognition that and the damage of climate change in terms of cost of living, you name it, and not whether it's here in Newfoundland or otherwise. We know we have more intensive forest fires, not that we have them, but the other part for us was to make sure that we didn't crash out of this economy. So part of the Just Transition was to make sure that whatever plan, there is a plan here to protect the workers of this province. And that means to make sure that there's a transition. You need to start to have that conversation right now, as opposed to waiting for it. I mean, I'll give you...
According to the International Agency, sorry to get it for a second, according to the International Energy Agency, the latest that they're still saying, world oil, gas, coal demand to peak by 2030. Now, coal is going to drop off, according to them, and the rest, oil, gas, will plateau for a couple decades. So this is where we are for where we should be looking as a province for our planning. Sorry, go ahead.
Then you don't wait until that time comes. I think you start the plan right now to have that transition, and look at how we can capture how we move into. I guess Newfoundland becomes a leader in renewable resources as well. We've never said in terms of let's shut things down right now, but the fact is, and I can think of the cod moratorium as a perfectly good example of that. Plenty of warnings that it was coming, and when it came, everyone was surprised, and we lost a huge number of people who had left this province as a result. We can't afford to see that happen. We also know that what happens to any community that's based on a non-renewable resource, once the companies decide that it's no longer financially viable, whether there's an amount there or not, they're going to leave the community or the province high and dry. Simple as that. So to me, my duty is to the people of the province and to the workers to make sure that whatever jobs come into this are going to be unionized, well compensated, and that the people can still, families can still support, or workers can still support their families, and communities will be viable as well. That's what was the purpose of it. It was twofold: to recognize the imperative of climate change, and also to make sure that we protect both. We're ready for the climate change itself, and also make sure that people are protected in this.
Mr. Parrott, what are your thoughts there? You did not agree with the minister going over to COP. Has anything changed there?
It's not that I didn't agree that they shouldn't be there. I said we should understand the agenda and understand what it is if we were to go in the future. I don't believe that we can turn the taps off to our oil and gas.
But in the quote, though, is, correct me if I'm wrong here, but to see a minister of the Crown go over to COP and, a $15,000 bill basically to celebrate what almost appears to be the beginning of the end of oil and gas industry,
exactly
it's a bit disturbing. Why do you care so much what the oil companies think when they need the oil, right? So why are you scared about what they think when it comes to him going over to something like COP?
Yeah, so listen, I believe we need a just transition into a green economy. A part of that includes our oil and gas. If we have oil and gas coming from this province that can be refined in North America, it eliminates ships coming from Russia, funding warlords. It eliminates ships coming from Saudi Arabia. All of these ships are burning bunker C. Mm-hmm. We do a lot when it comes to the environment, and a lot of people don't discuss that. As I said earlier, Muskrat Falls, Churchill Falls, Beta Spear, our hydro generation plants are fairly significant when you look at a population of 531,000. You've got the refinery started pumping oil today, renewable resource. We have never said turn the taps off. And I'll say I believe Mr. Dinn has said that in the House of Assembly, to be quite frank. And, when I look to the areas that their party represents in Labrador West and the coast of Labrador, I'd ask how Voisey's Bay, IOC, and Takora are going to continue on without that. If we turn the taps off on oil and gas, as I suggested, the minister's support was over at CAP, how do we support the people of Newfoundland and Labrador? We have a federal minister talking about the elimination of asphalt, and we have lots of people inside the federal and provincial government talking about turning off the taps to our oil and gas resource. And to be quite frank, with the state of our economy, the silver bullet to our green economy is our oil and gas. We ought to be looking at LNG. And when we talk about the Chancellor of Germany coming over to explore hydroelectricity and wind projects, the Chancellor of Germany came over here with a focus on LNG, and they were sold hydroelectricity and wind projects. So there's a belief that we can use LNG to transition. We have millions and billions and trillions of cubic feet of LNG offshore, and we can be a world leader in that at the same time while we develop our wind energy and our hydrogen. We can do all kinds of things simultaneously, and I believe that that's what we should be looking at.
Minister Davis, I feel you looking at me. You got some.
Yeah. So no, I couldn't agree more with Lloyd's comments on Stephen Guilbeault. I'm floored by some of the things that he says. I don't agree with him on a lot of things. That in particular, disappointed would be an understatement. About how he listens to his members in the Federation that are fighting for things that are regional in nature that he doesn't either understand or don't want to understand. So that's one thing. But I think the bigger thing about
sorry, for Minister Guilbeault, is this the comment where they were talking about just when it comes to federal funding, isn't it just because they say that if they're going to be paying for roads, they want to see a public transit aspect to it? Is that not it? Isn't that getting a bit confused there? Or
We're in Newfoundland.
But we need public transit in Newfoundland, do we not?
We do, but how do we put
especially in rural Newfoundland, do we not?
Absolutely. But you got to understand the cost associated, and you also got to have roads to put public transit on.
So
when has the federal government? When was the last time? When have they been in the business of funding roads here in the province? Anyways,
well, gas tax would be one example of what would be funding for roads for municipalities and others. But one of the bigger things, I think, it's when you. Lloyd said it earlier. When you get outside the bubble that is your own area, you start to understand a little bit more about the impacts of decision making that happens. It's easy for you to say public transit can be an answer when you're in the 905 or the 514, right? It's
completely different.
Easy to say that when you got a population center of 1 million people or 2 million people that can move people around. Very much different if you're in Lab West or if you're in Terra Nova or if you're in the Great Northern Peninsula. Much more difficult to do that. So, I mean, you've got to understand the province that we represent and the people that we represent. So, I mean, when we were arguing to, make sure changes reflected what we needed in our province, it's important that he understands that aspect. But, I mean, I want to just go back to COP for 1 second,
go ahead.
just to say COP has transitioned over the years from being purely about greenhouse gas reductions into mitigation and adaptation.
It's a big business meeting now, isn't it, as well?
It's a very big opportunity for you to be in front of people that are going to be out spending trillions of dollars in the global community. And people don't understand what Newfoundland and Labrador has to offer unless you tell them. Because, they may know where Canada's to, but they have no idea in some cases where Newfoundland and Labrador is and what the potential is that exists in some of the things that we've highlighted, critical minerals that we have that not many other places in the world has. The oil and gas that we do have produced off our shores is some of the best in the world, if not the best in the world. And then you look at the hydroelectric opportunity and the wind opportunity that we have. I mean, we're at a very positive spot in the province for a lot of things and a lot of opportunity for global community to be looking at this province for investment. And I think we're going to get that investment. And that only happens when people know what you're doing.
So what would you do differently for the PCs then, from what the minister's just saying there, Mr. Kerr?
So listen, again, we believe in climate change, and we absolutely believe that there needs to be a transition, but we need to keep the people who live here in mind. So I would say this. Let's take electric vehicles as an example. Mm-hmm. You tell me how someone who lives in downtown St. John's, you drive downtown St. John's today with 8 feet of snow that are out in front of the houses, you tell me how people are going to be able to charge their vehicles in places like that. We need to be looking at solutions before we just put these offers out. not just this government, successive governments have been guilty of throwing stones in the water and waiting to see where the ripples go. So it's no different when we offered this subsidy for electric vehicles throughout the province. And again, there are plenty of rural parts of Newfoundland where it just simply don't work. 100 amp services, smaller homes. People may be able to afford to buy the car. They get it home and they realize that they'll never be able. It'll cost them $20,000 to upgrade their homes. Heat pumps, same thing. We can transition from oil and gas by utilizing what we have at the same time while we simultaneously create a green economy. You know, we had a fuel issue yesterday out on Belle Island. It's just supply and demand. I mean, that's the reality of it. So as we transition away from oil and gas, all of these fuel delivery systems that are throughout the province are going to be less. They'll have a much smaller ability to deliver fuel from an economical standpoint, because if they relied on delivering 500,000 liters of fuel last year, this year they probably, with the addition of heat pumps, they may only deliver 120,000. So we need to keep all those things in mind as we transition.
So then when it comes to trying to keep temperatures like that 1.5 degree bit, talking about carbon neutral 2050, are you still in favor of being on track to do what it takes to do this, or do you think we need to change it? Because I don't know if it's for what you're saying. I don't know if that sounds like it's possible.
Our Blue Book has been very clear that we are committed to all of those things. 100% committed. But we need to understand. I've said this so many times. When you look at this province, what successive governments have done in the past is we go to every other jurisdiction in the country. We don't go to global best practices all the time. We do sometimes with certain things. But we compare ourselves to every other province. Well, guess what? Our population base is half and our geography is double. It's different here. And we need to recognize that. And we need to have solutions that are made right here in Newfoundland that are made for all of the people who live here. And we need to understand that how things are done in St. Anthony are different than how things are done in St. John's.
You're listening to The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. We are live streaming this show, cbc.ca/NL. We're talking about the politics of climate change in Newfoundland and Labrador and beyond. Joining me here in studio, you were just listening to Lloyd Parrott, PC Energy Critic and MHA for Terra Nova. Bernard Davis, Minister of Environment and Climate Change and Liberal MHA for Virginia Waters Pleasantville is here, as well as Jim Dinn, leader of the NDP and MHA for St. John's Centre. I want to go back to you, Mr. Dinn. Any thoughts just on what they're saying or just anything else that's coming up here?
Interesting that in Labrador West, IOC, I think, is ramping up its measures to go and to convert from oil to electricity, electrifying everything. Not necessarily because they're they have for altruistic reasons, but they also see the economic writing on the wall in terms of green steel and so on and so forth. So they've already got a plan in place for their company to deal with that. In other words, they've envisioned it. How do we get to that? With regard, and I hear, I guess, what it won't work in Newfoundland, or won't work because it works in St. John's and won't work out there. Or public transit, to me, demonstrates an enormous lack of imagination in many ways. Because we did have a public transit system here, the railway, but there was a political choice to move away from that rather than upgrade it or anything else to go to highways. We have made choices that basically, governments have made choices here that basically force people to rely on vehicles. Now, on the Northeast Avalon, well, there's room to grow there in terms if we want to look at public transit there, because there are people who would live in other parts of the province or the Avalon if they could have affordable public transportation. However that goes, people who can't live anywhere else because they don't have public transit. So I think for the most part, it comes down to about being creative. In terms of, we see it here, you just have to go around and most houses here, the number of mini splits or central heat pumps, it's already going. So that's fewer customers who are depending on oil. It's as simple as that. And they're looking for ways to do that. And, and you can see I think one company is not an oil company anymore. It's an energy company, and they've actually gotten into the mini split and central heat pump. They see the writing on the wall. So what we're saying here is let's take a look at the realities of not how it won't work in Newfoundland, or won't work. Electric cars won't work. It's coming. It's no different than any other technology, whether it's the cell phone, the PVR, you name it. The technology will keep improving to the point where we have no choice but to adopt it. So get ready for it. How do we plan for it? I think, too, when it comes to cost, and I'll agree with this, like the oil is an asset. Newfoundland has that asset there. And I think if it comes down that the federal government is looking for the transition, well, then we've got a resource that's there in the ground, and there's a price to that. So if it comes down to they're saying, well, that's got to stay in the ground, then what is the compensation? What is that worth to Newfoundland? And what compensation must they give to Newfoundland then to basically move us towards that greener, to transition to a more sustainable, just green economy? You can't talk about it without talking about the resource, but in many ways I think you look at it, there's a bargaining chip here. You want us to go this route? There's a value to it. Here's what we need in compensation because we want to protect our workers, we want to protect our communities, we want to make sure that we capitalize on.
It makes it an easier conversation as opposed to just giving up and you see money just go that is there for potential. So, okay. Looking at the governing party and also the opposition party, is that something you're asking for, demanding compensation to leave oil in the ground to stop, whether it's like potential projects, current ones, future ones, whatever?
And Adam, look, if that's what it's going to come down to, then I don't think we roll over. I said, wait a minute, there's a value to that. Let's get the compensation and use it for our own economic development and protect our workers and communities.
Sure, go for it.
I'll tell you what the cost is.
All right.
The cost is carbon tax.
Yeah.
And we can't afford it. You go to the grocery stores today and you have a look at what we're paying. You look at the cost of transportation.
We do get money back from the carbon tax, though, right?
We get very little.
Yeah.
But we get money back, but the costs that are created because we live in Newfoundland, because our goods come here on a ship that burns diesel, because Holyrood is a thermal generation plant, because we've got multiple thermal generation plants around this island, we pay more carbon tax as a province than most people realize. The cost of our taxes are higher because of it. The cost of our goods are higher because of it. So whilst individuals get a small, finite amount of money back twice a year, I think,
I think so, yeah.
It doesn't compensate for what it is. We do not support the carbon tax.
Well,
it is not going to solve our problem, and that is the money. That is the federal government's, and at one point the provincial government's stand on how we pay for, I guess, the cost of carbon and production of oil.
Any thoughts on what Minister Din just said, though, just around demanding compensation if we're going to leave
But
stuff in
that
the
is
ground?
where the compensation comes from. That is the compensation we're getting. I would argue that the federal government, I agree, but why are they going to pay for a resource? The federal government doesn't print money and give it to provinces. Money that the federal or provincial government comes from your pocket and my pocket. So money we get back is going to come from the people. So in pure liberal policy or NDP policy, we're going to take money out of the left pocket and put it back in the right pocket. Tell me how it works. I would challenge Mr. Din to tell me how that works. So while I don't disagree that at some way we need to find a way to compensate for the last revenue that's going to come from the production stop in oil and gas. We've got to find a way to compensate from that. That's got to come through population growth. It's got to come through mining. It's got to come through other resources, wind and hydrogen. Mm-hmm. Is the royalty regime that we've got set up for the current hydrogen process good enough? I don't think it is, personally. I believe that as long as these companies owe money, that they don't have to pay royalties. I think it's weak. I think we should have looked at it a little stronger. Where's the community benefits agreement that's associated with this? There isn't one. The provincial government hasn't set it up. In 2019, October, I think the 19th of October, they voted 100% unanimously in favor of a community benefits agreement. PMR I presented. Nothing has happened. So we need to look at ways to keep Newfoundlanders and Labradorians working. We need to look at ways to boost our tax revenue. And part of that is to entice people to move here. Part of that, you want to know what we need to do? We need to cut red tape. We need to get businesses. And listen, the minister went to COP. I clap my hands for him. It's good. If he went over and he enticed one company to come here and start a business, then good on you. But what I will say is we need to bring a lot more than one company here, and we need to focus a lot more than on green energy, and we need to grow, and that is how we'll compensate for oil and gas. But as long as oil and gas is being produced in this world and we have it off our shores, and we can produce our own oil and gas instead of bringing it from Russia and funding a warlord or bringing it from Saudi Arabia, then we should be looking for a way to do that.
Mr. Davis.
There's a lot to unpack in those
There's a lot. There's a couple
in
things there, a
those-
couple points. Yeah,
in
we can
those
do a couple
two,
shows.
conversations.
Yep.
So I would like to say that I agree with two of my colleagues in two different areas in what they said. So I can't. I agree with Mr. Parrott in the fact that we did lobby the federal government quite hard to remove the carbon tax and don't oppose it, get rid of it, because they don't factor in, and Lloyd is right, they don't factor in the transportation of the goods to get here.
Yep.
They may pay and compensate a portion of the population for the use of carbon tax, which is, I applaud them, that's great. But it's the whole point of goods coming to this province, the only way they can get here is by boat and truck. You know, some plane, I guess, but you know, there's going to be a carbon tax associated with that that wasn't factored into the formula for that, and that's something that we were, both myself and the Premier were lobbying Minister Guilbeault and the Prime Minister about. But I guess the other piece is we've got a very successful EV program, and that's happening. Our electric vehicle transition program that's happening. I mean, we've seen since 2018 1,000% increase in EVs driving on our roads, which is where we need 40%, more than 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions in this province comes from the transportation side.
Yeah.
So, like, if we can crack that nut there, we're going to see some benefits. And yes, I do realize that parts of the province are more challenging than others to have change of mindset. But you know, if you actually looked in your own household, how much do you drive? You would probably come to the assessment that better than 95% of the people in this province could have an electric vehicle based on what they drive. Like, you know, so
where
I think
does
that's
public
important.
transit come in for you, though? Because I know, like, yes, it's a very complicated province, Newfoundland and Labrador, if we're saying public transit throughout. But for the Northeast Avalon, and you've got Metrobus ridership going through the roof, right? Have you thought about more investment to try to really kind of up the system that's existing?
We have invested. We've invested $2.5 million, I think it was, in bus passes for the
I know.
the people on income support and the most vulnerable in society. I was a commissioner on Metrobus before politics,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I understand how important it is for public transit to be here and expand as much as you can. It's almost like you build it and they will come. Philosophy, but Metrobus, I think, works from the other way. Even when I was there, you know, you've got to see the ridership in order to
But they're there
invest in it.
now.
And they are.
And so why
which
not
is
double
really
down
good.
is my
but
question.
They are. And it's a City of St. John's run entity. So, like, I don't want to speak out of turn from something that I don't know everything about, other than what I see, what my constituents deal with. There's a lot of people that would ride the Metrobus system or public transit system or paratransit system if it was more accessible than it is. And I know they're making strides to make it better.
Money
And
really helps that.
We're also investing in that, though. We've invested in the ability to move to electric buses. I toured a facility in just outside Montreal about electric buses, looking at it from not just the paratransit and transit system, but also from our school bus situation. Because, I mean, that's an ideal opportunity for the province to be looking at. So, you know, there's lots of opportunity there. We can't be looking, close the box around the province and put walls up to say that we can do this all ourselves. We can't do it all ourselves. There's a lot of investment that needs to come in. And one company, I want 101 companies coming in next week, tomorrow, to invest in our province in a lot of different areas, not just hydrogen, not just mining, in a lot of different areas.
Mr. Dean, response to Mr. Parrott or what the minister's saying?
With, you know, in the end, people are going to go with the cheapest oil, regardless of who's making it. That's the first thing. You know, whether it's going to fund a warlord or not, it doesn't make any difference. People will go with the companies will go with the cheapest oil. As simple as that. But I will say this. When I look at the public transit, I forget what company or what person I was speaking to in the last month. It's basically, companies will come. One of the things that they're looking for is how robust a public transit system that we have. And I guess part of it is because the workers who might depend on it need to get back and forth to work. So I think in many ways you look at public transit as for many people who are choosing not to have a car. They're depending more and more on that. So at least let's look at the more populated areas. Let's start with them in the province, and how do we make that work here? On the Northeast Avalon, that's an easy one to start addressing, and then we could look at what models work elsewhere. I guess, and I had a wonderful thought then. It's gone from my mind.
It happens.
But you know, I look at in terms of of seeking the solutions, because there's no use. I'm not going to throw up my hands and say, well, that it only works in the St. John's area. But I see the benefits of a public transit system, and it's about it's an alternative. It's something there that gives the people who are no longer buying a vehicle. And I know the point I had to make.
Go for it.
I look at the engine hours on my truck.
Yeah.
Which means when I look at the number of hours the engine has been running, means that most of the truck that I've had for the last 5 years has been sitting parked somewhere. That's what I'm paying for. Basically, what I'm paying for is convenience more than anything else. So, it's when I look at how I get around. Now, I will take the bus to work. I get a direct route. It's actually pretty efficient. I can get there quicker than walking and maybe a little bit not as fast as driving. But the fact is, it can work. So whether it's you got Corner Brook, you've got large major area. How do we look at the transit system within each of those? Because there are people who need it, and that's efficient, that's effective, like any major city or any of the cities for that matter, and have that vision, but one that works for us. But I see the value of it because I know more and more people I know in the metro area and others are looking for an alternative than having to rely on or buy a car, especially if they can afford it. As for costs, I've listened to about the with regards to the cost of living being directly affected by the carbon tax. If you look at some research, it's minimal. What we're hearing, though, is that what never gets discussed is the cost of the effect on the cost of living of climate change, of the forest fires, of crop failures, of insurances levels that are going up for everyone, regardless of where we live. All these things, like the overwhelming cost of climate change that we've got to address. If we're talking about affordability, let's talk about all of that as well, instead of pinning it on just on one thing. And let's start looking at something other than the vehicle itself. About how do we make sure that everyone in a democratic society has access to transportation.
Mr. Parrott, what do you think about that? Because whenever I do shows on newcomers, I hear from folks saying that obviously public transit is a big priority, and like we've all been saying, Newfoundland and Labrador, a lot going on depending on what community you're in for the realities of it. But to have pockets of investment for public transit and whatever else, that could save a cost of living. It's better for the environment, and it just makes it so that people can get around without having to have a vehicle with insurance and all that stuff.
Yeah, so listen, public transit is key, and Mr. Davis will probably remember when an announcement was made on Metrobus there, the renewal there, I think it was 2 years ago. I was one of the people who stood up in the House of Assembly and said, that's great for Metro St. John's. What about the rest of Newfoundland and Labrador? So again, it's a solution that's very finite to a certain area, and everywhere is different and unique. And maybe in some areas it's subsidized cabbing for low-income people, but it's not just people that are on social assistance. I mean, obviously we need
seniors.
Absolutely,
exactly right
absolutely.
For getting around.
It's something that we need to look at and find a way to do. And Mr. Din mentioned earlier about the train, and I used to work in the transportation industry, transportation construction. So, I believe that the cost of getting goods here is greatly affected. And obviously we had a different gauge rail bed. There was numerous reasons for us to shut down the rail bed. And part of that was that we weren't in line with the rest of Canada and, just couldn't work the way it was designed to work. Again, an oversight. I got to go back to something Mr. Din said, though. Yeah. And I need to clarify the fact that oil and gas is a commodity. It's a regulated price per barrel. So it's not about going and getting the cheapest price per barrel. It's a global price, so we know what it costs. The whole idea of shipping it around the world, if we're talking about a carbon footprint, when oil leaves Russia and gets on a tanker that holds 50 million barrels of oil and it burns bunker C from Russia to the North Atlantic Oil Refinery or New York City or whatever. It's not just the cost associated, though. It's the carbon footprint that's associated with it.
But the biggest carbon bomb is what's in the ships, though, right?
Absolutely.
And it's the oil. So,
absolutely.
If we're going to talk about global leadership, one of the biggest, we can do whatever we want in Newfoundland and Labrador for people and for EVs and everything else. But the biggest effect we could have for the carbon being put into the atmosphere would be not drilling for oil, right? I mean,
I disagree. So
that's the biggest impact.
If everyone did the same thing, if we could eliminate it. But it's not just about vehicles. We depend on oil for everything. The headphones you're wearing right now, the glasses you have on, the clothes we wear, the food we eat on a daily basis. EVs are going to require it. How do we mine for the rare earth minerals? How do we do all of these things? I think the spec is right now they're saying somewhere in the vicinity of 24 million barrels a day in 2050 they still think we're going to need. Mm-hmm. So when you think of what we produce here as a province, why can't we be a leader in that? Why can't we still be producing if we have functional offshore vessels that can do it right now? That's my point.
Yeah.
My point isn't, listen, Advance 2030 was a plan that the Liberal government came out with, and they said there were 600 finds out there of fields as big as Hebron or Hibernia. The reality of it is we know it's there. How do we get to hydrogen? There has to be a transition. Why not utilize LNG, which is a much cleaner option than the oil? There's got to be a way to go from step A to step B, because if we eliminate everything instantaneously, there are going to be repercussions from in our healthcare. Everything that depends on oil and gas is still going to depend on it.
Yeah, I mentioned this before in the air. There's a New York Times bit that mentioned what we're looking for. It's a 21st century lifestyle, but with a carbon output of the late 1800s, right? And it's like, how do we get there? And that's difficult. Mr. Davis, thoughts?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. It's difficult. There is a transition period that we require. I mean, Mr. Didden mentioned something earlier that I wanted to sort of agree with him on, to say that, we are seeing a lot of people transition to from oil in homes to electric furnaces and or mini splits on the side of houses. So we see it all the time. That would happen even if the government was not involved. It would happen. But it would not happen as fast as we're doing it now. And the reason why governments invest in this is to spark people to make that choice today versus 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So, I mean, we've seen some great success in the oil to electric program. I mean, we've had some 2,000 applications in right now that will be approved, or most of them will be approved based on criteria. And those homes, I mean, we're hoping to transition 10,000 to the 40,000 that we have in this province from dependence on oil to electricity for a couple of reasons, not just because of the greenhouse gas emissions, which is the primary focus of why I'm doing it in my department, but the other secondary successes on this is, cost of living. It reduces by some people by 40 to 60% of your electricity costs. In addition to that, it's also an adaptation strategy for when it's really hot in the summer. It gives seniors an opportunity, not just seniors, everybody, an opportunity to have a cooling environment.
Yeah, in fact, we need AC now,
right.
like growing up in the
Correct.
80s when, might have been a day or two.
So the whole idea of the heat pumps is brilliant, right?
Yeah.
But where we fail is that we have a good many people in this province who depend on Newfoundland and Labrador housing. Government hasn't taken steps to put heat pumps in Newfoundland. Our most vulnerable people, we haven't gone and done that. I mean, it's the easiest thing they could do right now, immediately. They could up the amount of heat pumps in this province substantially, very quickly. One contract to put a heat pump in every one. Get them off oil, the reliance, blah, blah. Biomass. We've got biomass from our from Sexton's Lumber, from the wood mill over in Corner Brook. Why aren't we utilizing that? Why isn't Memorial using biomass? We've got lots of opportunities to make substantive change instantaneously, get away from oil and gas in some of these areas, which is what they depend on. But government red tape and regulations is a big part of why we do it. So as we try to transition, we've got to look for ways to eliminate the red tape and give people the ability to do that.
We only have a couple minutes left. I want to play one other clip. You've all heard this already. But I want to ask a couple questions about it. So this is the Ches Crosby clip, former leader of the PC party. And I know he's a private citizen now, so I'm not going to go that direction with it. But here's what, so Ches Crosby made the comments last week at a Senate Standing Committee on Natural Resources in Ottawa. Andy, give that a whirl.
The climate changes all the time. Personally, having looked into the whole subject matter, I think that the theory that carbon output caused by humans is causing catastrophic climate change is bogus. So that's my answer.
When you have someone like Mr. Crosby doing that kind of talk in that setting, right, a Senate Standing Committee, does that make your work in the community more difficult when you're trying to get folks on board with your plans for talking about, hey, here's the reality of climate change, here's what we're trying to do?
I'm going to put my trust in science and the various scientists with the many years of experience and education.
I know
behind
that, but I'm just talking
to
about
me,
people listening to him.
This just clouds the issue. I would have to have to ignore what the gentleman said.
But people listen to people like Mr. Crosby.
Oh, I know.
My question is, does it make it more difficult?
It's unfortunate, quite honestly, that anyone would listen to him at all. It's just one more thing that I don't agree with him on. Add to the list of the 100 other things that I don't agree with him on. It adds credibility to a voice that without looking at science, and adds credibility to people that don't believe that this is actually happening when we're seeing it every day. We see it in all of our lives. I can't even fathom how someone that was in a position of authority, a position of power, a position of trust, public trust, would go on and say something that's so categorically false. And
Is it embarrassing then, as a Newfoundlander and Labradorian?
It's unbelievably embarrassing for him. I believe that's the reason why people got it right in Windsor Lake and defeated him, quite honestly.
Mr. Parent, what do you think?
Yeah, listen, it's difficult. When you're put in a position of public trust, as three of us are here, and you're having a conversation about something that is real, there's no question. I always refer back to I'm a 51-year-old individual who grew up in Labrador West. I grew up in Labrador, and I've seen temperatures of minus 100. I've seen snowfall accumulations, in the 18 to 25 feet over a winter. And now we look at races like Cane's Quest that are happening. And
Last year, they're trying to see this year what's going to go on with
Labrador,
it.
listen,
Sea ice
climate
issues,
change is
the
real.
green
There's
on the
no mistake
Torringats
about it.
growing up.
Yeah. So what I would say about that is I categorically don't agree with Mr. Crosby, nor does our leader, Tony Wakeham. And I would say that we need to make change for people, and we need to believe the science. Science is undebatable. The reference where this came from was Bill C-49, I believe. And I encourage people to investigate what that is. I mean, it's turning around our Atlantic Accord, which I will say that Mr. Fury has agreed with 100%, and I would categorically disagree with that. I think it gives Ottawa too much authority over Newfoundland. When people would argue that it gives Newfoundland a right back, it certainly does. But if they want to get C-49 right, it should include our fisheries, and it should include our oil and gas, and it should be an Atlantic Accord that's for offshore Newfoundland and Labrador, not just for offshore wind projects in Newfoundland and Labrador. And they won't do that. They won't do it for a reason. So while I think that Mr. Crosby is wrong, climate change is not bogus, it is very real, I believe that there's a larger picture issue here, and that was what was being discussed.
Ms. Davis, you want to respond to any of that?
Yeah, no, I'm glad my colleague, although I pretty much knew he wouldn't agree with Mr. Crosby on that. And after sitting in the house with Mr. Crosby, dealing with him on many issues, I mean, there's things that I agree with him on, like on some things. But like we all as elected officials and leaders in the community should sing it from the treetops that like climate change is real, and everything we can do, as little as it is or as big as it is, should be done every day. Like little things we can do.
Well, I mean, but it's the big things that make the difference.
Absolutely.
Right?
But I agree that all the big things make an issue, and that's what we're doing as a government to try to do that. But every household plays a role in trying to do this, not just here in small Newfoundland and Labrador in what we have to do, but the footprint of the entire global community has to be better, and we're all trying to do that. And Lloyd is right when he says that we need to do it as a collective, and we do well in Newfoundland and Labrador, punch well above our weight, and that's true. But there's always more to be done, and we're going to continue to do that as government. And I would hope that Mr. Crosby will hopefully clarify those comments over time.
Final thoughts, Mr. Din, before I go to Mr. Parent.
Transitioning is scary. There's no two ways about it, and I guess there's fear for what the future holds, and if we're going and as to how we're going to proceed and how we're going to benefit from this, if we're going to be better off or worse off. Quick example, again, the heat pumps. I would say many people, you're seeing an increase in that because people are starting, they do work and they work well. It's not as bad as we thought it was. Actually, it's better. So I think for the most part, whatever we do with transition, I think it's imperative on all parties here that we manage this and have a plan for it, not only in terms of phasing out, but also whatever green transition, whatever we transition, there's a plan around this so that we get the maximum benefit.
Mr. Barrett, final word today goes to you. 30 seconds.
Yeah, so listen, I would say whatever future holds for us from an environmental standpoint, climate change standpoint, the one thing that we're responsible for as politicians is the men and women that live in this province. And as we transition, we can't forget that. And the damage that is possible for governments to make to the people that live here, from a housing crisis to, the cost of living is near and dear. We go and we look at Tent City and we look at the things that are going on. We need to keep that in mind as we transition, and that is where the future is. We got to think about the present as we go to the future.
Thank you, all three of you, for this today. I really appreciate it. Thank you. So that's we had Bernard Davis, Lloyd Parrott, Jim Din. Freudian slip there, Mr. Din. Thank you for listening, and thank you for all of you who are watching on that today. Looking ahead for another Signal tomorrow. We're talking about accessibility in this province, and we're asking you, how accessible is your community in winter? We're going to have a panel discussion, but the text line and the emails will be open. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and we'll do it all again tomorrow. Cheers.